Hey, Lucas, thanks for the reviews and discussion on the PRs. Appreciate that. All right, a couple more minutes. Want to make sure that Jana is here, and we'll see if Warren can make it too. All right. I've pinged John. I think you should be joining. He'll be leading some discussion for later on kind of deployments and incentives. But so overall today, what we wanted to cover was some of the updates on the document that we have that we've been discussing for a while now. We haven't been meeting super recently, but we'd like to progress work on the greasing document that Lucas is kindly authoring for us. This is something where I was also spending some time this week trying to help add some text, and I think it'd be good to discuss some of the open questions there, and also what type of shape we think it should be in. Currently, the status of this document, the greasing document in here, I can start sharing it, is that it is something that we're tracking in the program. It's not formally adopted as like an active IAB document, but that is something that I'd like to get going soon, and that would essentially involve having the IAB just say like, is this something that we think we should be working on, but then also usually goes through a broader community review to like the architecture discuss list and just letting everyone know that this is something that people are talking about. And please kind of send your it's not like an adoption call feedback, but it's similar to that. So what I want to figure out is like, what shape do we think the document would be in to be ready for that type of more external review. Yeah, and then for just the meeting discussion today, we have a small group. Obviously, we can use the Meet Echo queuing, but I would welcome people to just you can also just unmute yourself and jump in. And if it gets too chaotic, then of course we can use queuing. But I think we can just have more of a discussion here. I think this is more of like a roundtable type thing. So I guess to start, Lucas, maybe could you give kind of a bit of background on the history of this and like where you are seeing this document at this point?
Sure, I don't have a prepared statement, I'm afraid.
That's fine.
It's just indicative of the number of cycles I've been able to give this for the last, I don't know, it's like a year, at least a year, probably two, if we went all the way
Yeah.
back to the start. But effectively, my elevator pitch for this document is that the IAB has already published a couple of drafts about protocol maintenance and like long-term viability of documents, which is a kind of a good abstract high-level discussion for protocol designers and the IETF itself, in considering how it might adopt work or how the ISG might review this, etc. But that what was kind of lacking is a capture of concrete guidance to help the protocol designers do something. So the example would be the TLS uses greasing, so does Quick, so do a few other things. They've established kind of patterns of how they define things that seem to work for them. Those are examples of how you could do it. I'm not going to mandate people particularly do something one way or the other, because every kind of protocol has its own considerations it needs to make. But yeah, if you're going to use grease values, a good pattern is to define them explicitly. So you're going to need to interact with IANA, and you might want to do that with a spread spectrum through the code space, but you might not be able to do that because of other things. So if you don't and you pick this, these are the kind of pitfalls that could hurt you and hit you. So that's it for greasing. But the other thing we discussed, and was kind of really the genesis for some of this work, is that experiences have shown that just using the protocol as it's defined in normal operation, so not this like active greasing that you ignore, but that just doing something a bit different than everyone else is ossified on and breaking their expectations can hurt you. So the example in the document isn't a brilliant one. It's a bit contrived, but if you're always doing a workload that has like a data flow from client to server, sorry, from server to client, it's always a download, and suddenly the client starts uploading. There could be things on the path that are just not expecting that. They might have assumed that the volume of data in a direction is low and applied throttles or rate limited or something. Like there's a whole bunch of assumptions that get built up over time, and then those break, and the way that the assumptions break can lead to failures of the protocol, of its interoperability, which is and it's something we had an issue for, and you proposed some new text, Tommy, is kind of the incentives and disincentives for adopting or adding grease and variability. At what point in the life cycle of a protocol design and deployment would it make sense to try and adopt some of these principles? It's really hard to put the horse back in the stable, dependent on the system you're targeting. So even on some of the text, my brain started going, and it's like, if you're a new deployment of an existing protocol and you want to exercise some of the guidance in here because it's best common practice, even though we're not calling this a BCP, it might work really well in your limited deployment where you're working with a small subset of a population of implementations. But as soon as you open that up to the internet, you might have to see like transitive failures. So that's probably my summary to date. I'd say if in a status update, there's a fair amount of text in there. You've made a lot of nice proposals in the last week, Tommy, to actually improve the legibility of this, and I think they're really positive improvements. We do have a range of issues that have been opened over the last couple of years. A lot from me, just in terms of effectively brain dumping things we might want to add, not that we should, but just capturing them while they've come up in thought or in other sessions we've held across the years. But there have been others opened by other people too. Dave Taylor and Gori come to mind for that, but I'm sure there's others too. So I think in terms of I can't remember how you phrase it, not the adoption call, but is this a thing we should adopt? I don't feel like we need to address all of those issues, but that things that make this clear on its goals and its intent and its target audience is really what we need to help the community understand what we're asking them for interest in.
Exactly. Right. And so the thing I'd like to get to is kind of like the adoption for active IAB document, which does this review and architecture discuss. And I think, like, as you were saying, like making sure that even, the document doesn't need to be done. It doesn't need to have all the issues closed, all the examples it's going to have, but it needs to be clear, like, what is the main thrust of it, so that when we get feedback or ideas, they're productive. And I think also getting this out will help solicit other ideas or examples that I think can then help us build the momentum to just get it done. Because I think we don't need to sit on it all that much longer. So there is the GitHub here. And so actually what I have on the screen right now is the rendered version that includes the 3 pull requests that I made, just so we can kind of talk through that. There are a couple points that I'd like to use as some starting points for a discussion and getting feedback from people. And, thank you, Gory. I saw also you were writing some comments on here. So there are 3 pull requests that are currently up. And so there's the GitHub here. If people can see this, yeah. So these are some 3 new ones. They're just trying to kind of break down the structure of changes. I did not kind of get to the editorial pass on some of the later parts about protocol variability, but I'll try to work on that soon. So the first one, and Lucas, I think you approved it already, so thank you, is like mainly just trying to rework the abstract and the intro to make it very clear how this is distinct from some of the previous IAB documents that came out of EDM and some other previous efforts around protocol extensibility, etc. And to contextualize this as saying, like, hey, we've already established active use in the use it or lose it draft, and we've already established maintenance in the protocol maintenance draft. And we kind of want to say that, like, yeah, we've established that these are important, but some of these techniques, you can, like, they're becoming common, or we're seeing patterns across the IETF. And there are, like, specific pieces of advice that make it more or less effective. And those, as Lucas, as you were saying, like, those other documents are pretty high level in terms of saying, like, you can generate fake values, you can move things around, and that can help. But there's a lot of details that people need. I changed some of the focus of, like, the main other RFCs that we refer to, because I think this is mainly tied to the use it or lose it draft, or the protocol viability one that introduces the high level idea of greasing and variability. And so we kind of start with that, and then explain that kind of the history of some protocols using this, but the fact that actually applying grease or applying protocol variability isn't straightforward. It's not trivial, and there are some pitfalls that we've seen, and we're trying to say, like, hey, everybody, like, your own protocols are your own protocols, but, like, here's like, the advice and the kind of the collective wisdom on this topic of, like, yeah, these things have broken before. And that's the point of these discussions we're having. So I guess, I mean, if anyone has comments on this overall structure for the abstract and intro, let me know. Otherwise, I think it's relatively less, there's not too much to talk about it on it now. If you could just give a review on that pull request, if there are any textual or clarity issues, that would be good. So then the first kind of meaty section of the document is going into greasing. I think some of the later sections around protocol variability also need to be made more meaty to be like this, but we can do that later. So this essentially introduces the notion of the, like, grease values, and then is trying to give a breakdown of, like, the high level pieces of advice of, like, hey, you should actually define and register these values, and we try to give examples of the various protocols that have done that, so you can use that as a reference. It talks about, like Lucas was alluding to, that you should have large ranges, and you should generally have some type of algorithm, so you don't have to like tell IANA like, here's 70 values that are random to like put in there, because that's a pain. And talks about like, you know, the impact on contiguous blocks. A lot of this stuff was previously in the document, is just being rearranged. We want to go into some detail for the actual IANA considerations, and like what are the best practices for registering this, so that you can be a good maintainer of your registries and make it clear. Then when we're so like essentially this first part is like guidance to the people defining these things in the protocol, and then there's a bit about more like how you actually use it. And these are both like what values, or like what types of grease do you choose to include, and like that should be unpredictable in order to be effective. And then there's also like this temporal aspect about uh, not just using unpredictable values, but using grease itself unpredictably. So they're, you know, related, but they're different angles of unpredictability. And this is one area where I had like a to-do in here for the unpredictability I think is worth some discussion. I'd like to hear feedback, I guess, from people who have maybe, you know, done greasing. I know, Lucas, you've definitely deployed this type of stuff, but from others, when we're talking about the unpredictability, uh, are there more concrete pieces of guidance we can give, right? So like I think it's a little bit easier for like using the unpredictable values. So like, you know, let's say you have a big space, like a 64-bit space, you have a lot of grease values, and it's like, you know, don't always pick the same one, because that's not unpredictable, and you just end up ossifying on that. I added some commentary in here about the fact that like it could be like a single server or client or whatever, your protocol participant could randomly pick different grease values, or you could have a situation where some population picks one value, and like across a large population you have an unpredictable set. um, I think both of those achieve some of the goals. If people disagree, I'd love to hear that. But then I think it's a bit more complicated when we talk about the like when to use grease and how to make that effective, to be unpredictable but also useful. Because I think there are sweet spots in there where you're using it the right amount to catch things and to make sure that you're preventing ossification. And you could have situations where you use grease too infrequently, like if it's like 0.1% of the time and no one notices and no one cares when things break. You could have cases where you're using it 99% of the time, and you're like potentially being wasteful, but also uh, like allowing everyone to kind of like ossify around. Like, I'm just going to hard code these values because I always see these other values, and it just becomes part of the constant fingerprint. Um, so I guess, what is there something useful we could say here about like where is that sweet spot and how to determine that sweet spot for your protocol? Lucas and other people, please jump in.
Yeah, I entered the key because I value other people's input too. But yeah, if no one's going to talk, then time box me. I don't know on this one. It's kind of tricky. I don't know if we're going to be able to say this is the sweet spot. I think that's impractical because of the range of protocols we're trying to target. You know, I'm tainted by what I have experience with, and be very easy to write this document just based on that. And I don't want that. The hope is we you know, to get this document um, on a track where other people are going to give us other use cases and other examples, or and other pitfalls that they foresee or whatever. But in this case, like, to give concrete examples of some of the stuff you're talking about, in HTTP3 we have these unidirectional streams that have a type for them, and there's some well-defined types, and there's going to be now, 5 years later, there's going to be more use of other types because of web transport or other protocols that are now building on it. But at the time, this extension point wasn't going to be widely used, so we defined grease, what we call grease streams, which just use a grease value at the start of the stream, but they don't do anything. Like, one, we ignore the value, but also it's kind of safe to ignore the things that are on that greased stream itself. You could either put them in a sink, just dev null them, or you can close that stream safely and it doesn't interact. It doesn't cause any problems there. But there's a cost to these streams. They do carry data. They do contribute towards a congestion window. They do add overheads to some extent. And I think the initial deployment idea we had was, oh, we'll do this for a while Quick is still going through standardization. And once we have a number of clients that aren't complaining, we'll turn this off. We'll turn it on for every connection to Cloudflare, and the library that powers our Quick and HTTP3 implementation. But at some point, we'll make this configurable and turn the default. Well, it is already configurable, but we'll make the default off. What we didn't want to do is send grease streams all the time, and we didn't want to send some of the time. So and effectively we got to an equilibrium, I would say, where actually the balance of the overhead of sending two grease streams at the start of a connection seems fine to us when we don't plan to turn it off, because of the kind of the inoculating effect it can have for any new entry to the market of a Quick implementation that isn't with the kind of the peloton of implementations that are all doing the same thing because they turn up at hackathons and they're all like, oh yeah, we do this, okay, that's a great idea, I'll copy it, and or I've just tried it and I'm sat with you and you can explain why I'm crashing out on this thing. So I expect people for protocol maintenance, people will develop something like a student, understanding what protocols are, and they'll start testing against some public endpoint on the server and immediately see the impact of these grease streams and something. I think Robin Marks, when he was still in academia, used Cloudflare's quick greasing as an example for his students about like how to dissect in Wireshark what this thing is, because it was kind of unexpected and that kind of thing. But to get back to your point, yeah, the using these things too infrequently, I think, is the important part. If you can't observe failure, whether you're the participant causing that failure, or the one experiencing it yourself, like both sides might be able to observe it, but might not be. And if you can't, the person that's going to suffer is the end user potentially, depending on the nature of the failure. So I think that is definitely a kind of motivator for pushing to do this more frequently than not, if you're going to do it at all. Because if you do it too infrequently, you might as well not do it. That's kind of how my thought process is going.
Yeah. I guess that kind of brings up another point, and maybe we should mention this as well, that there should be ideally like some way to report or measure failure. I mean, it seems to be slightly related to like the idea that it's like if it's too infrequent to notice, kind of regardless of the frequency, like what matters is that someone does notice. And I guess that's more in like the case of like the person who is entering, like potentially has like the new implementation. But I don't know if there's anything that would be useful to say there, because like presumably the person who's kind of coming into it with a new implementation, like if they're not handling the extensibility right, like they didn't read the documents, or you know, they're missing some of it, and so it's hard to give guidance to those people of like, you should measure your if you're hitting problems because you're not handling these cases.
Yeah, and I think I was kind of getting into on some of the commentary on your pull request for Tommy, but like this is the discussion is here is like protocol implementers, but there's another population of people who are like protocol users or something. I don't know how to call them, but in my world, right, we have customers who are maybe using their own origin server in a public cloud like AWS or GCP or whatever, and they have an implementation of a web server traffic that a web server that they use, and then for some reason they decide they want to onboard with a CDN or some other intermediary that does things differently, and it's that intermediary has always done things differently, but that the customers suddenly starts to see an issue either directly themselves or indirectly, depending on the level of monitoring that they have. This does happen quite often. It's not just about greasing. It's like the ones we see a lot. I'm always expecting this kind of HTTP response header, and you don't send this, and it's breaking my clients. There was one the other day. What was it now? Somebody was asking, could we support not sending not requiring a host header on a HTTP request? It's like this is something that's been there for 20 years. Like it's not greasing, but the expectation is you're changing some part of the system, and that is causing a breakage and a failure for that population. I don't know if we want to get into any of that in this document. It feels like it could snowball out of control and not
Yeah.
address the target audience we have here. It's a good consideration, but it's maybe something we should defer for some other discussion.
Yeah, if it's not something like practical or actionable from it, then you don't need it. Gory, I see you in queue.
Yeah, I was just. I don't build production protocols, but I do test packets to see whether production protocols work. And I'm just kind of wondering how, if there's any tie in here, because the things I get are anomaly reports from network providers who say, "Oh, this is not a normal flow," or "Hey, have you been hacked?" You go, "No, I'm just trying some new code points." Yeah. So, well, I mean, I guess internal values. Yeah, I mean, that's kind of fair game. If we're talking about unpredictability and when we test or something, then maybe that comes up in the anomaly detection more often, because our usual trick is just to spread stuff out in time, and then people kind of go, "Oh, there's quite a lot of strange stuff here, but there's not enough to worry about." So I don't know how unpredictable the pattern should be to not raise alarms from network management or monitoring systems. Do we have any feeling for that?
I mean, I guess like what is the goal? Like, do we not want to raise the alarms? Because like recently I'm looking at like in TLS, adopting new algorithms for like post quantum TLS, whatever, and out there that will like have fingerprints for the expected TLS handshakes, and they'll be like, "Oh, you're some security risk because you're doing anything different than what we expect you to do, and you're not allowed to use this system." Not because it's breaking the protocol, and it's actually not a protocol handshake problem. It's like they just you seem suspicious because you're different. And the way to get through those eventually is just to make the differentness common enough that they can't, like, they don't key on that as like, oh, this is weird. And like that's not a case of even using grease value, it's just adopting a new value overall. And in order to have prove the implementation, you need sufficient volume. Because if you're too low or too random, people will just be like, this is suspicious and doesn't matter.
Okay, we can argue both ways then. So
exactly.
Yeah, I mean, I get quite a lot of grief when I manage to annoy a network provider who's several hops away from our network. And, you know, I mean, I don't like that grief. So if you're going to create that as part of my application, then I have to deal with a whole line of managers to sort that out. But I do want my protocols to work and evolve. So, yeah, okay, I will stop talking and let you think.
All right. I think that's good. Oh, Gord, did you want to get back in? Nope. Okay. All right. Yeah, I'll need to think about something practically to say, but I think there is some discussion we could add here around the frequency of use. It sounds like, you know, we would agree that like you need at least some level of frequency to be useful to achieve the goals. But I think we can bring in some of the discussion around just like who actually notices this, and just kind of consider your frequency depending on what goals you have for your greasing.
Yeah, just to add, has come to mind, you know, one of the lowest levels of frequency would be like an annual flag day or something, right? That that is well publicized ahead of the time to maybe address Corey's point of no one knows what we're doing this at a particular time, and all the alarms fire and they don't know why. I don't like those flag days myself, but that might be something we could at least. I don't know if there's been documented in any formal way previously, but maybe worth citing if it has.
Yeah, that's a good point. And we could even just somewhere in here talk about the different approaches that, like, right, flag days are one style, and like that also implies some degree of coordination, versus, you know, other things that are like, I'm always going to do this, or it's more kind of organic, and those just have different properties. Like, right, I mean, you could argue that it's not grease, but like, you know, controlled coordinated protocol variability, or it's like when people did IPv6 flag days, it's like, let's flood the network with these packets that they're not used to seeing to just raise awareness. And it's not too different from what we're talking about here. Okay.
So I think maybe this section should cover a little bit of the discussion that you guys just had, that saying the more often you do it, the more effectively it might be, but it might also raise alarms for somebody else, so it might cause trouble for somebody else. So you should take that into account, and you have to prepare to deal with these complaints from other people.
Right. I think this also ties into the section that I'm proposing later on incentives, which is something that Dave Taylor had raised. So I do want to get to that a little bit later, and I have questions on what we want to say there. And I think that point you're just bringing here is good. Like, that would fit in well, and potentially is like a forward reference we could add here.
Yeah, I mean, there's a general question about the risks and dangers of doing this is all, but then I think at least you all discussed it right now, there seems to be a difference in, like, if you do it very rarely, probably, you know, it's fine, but if you do it very often, then it might have more consequences for others as well. So there is a point about how often you do it.
Exactly. Yeah, that's really, thank you. Okay, so the next section in there was about not handling as a special case. I tried to add some more details in here based on an issue that Martin Thompson had raised, where he gave like a very specific example of how HTTP streams that can be used for web transport or HTTP3 interact, like how you check that interacts with checking for grease, and that he was noticing a common pattern where people would end up special casing grease in their logic, and that was like the wrong thing to do. So one option is like we could give like that concrete example of that protocol. I tried to write it in an abstract form here, just like here's the general category of essentially like you have some defined values, you have some defined grease values, and you can have scenarios in your protocol where of your defined values, you want to be strict and only accept some of them. And when you're doing that, it's easy to, in one variation, disallow the grease values, which could be a problem. But then if you're trying to work around that, it is potentially tempting or easy to hard code and special case the grease values along with the allowed values, and then you end up defeating the purpose of the grease values, and you're still blocking extensibility for new things. I think it's an interesting case. It probably could use a bit more clarity and polishing. One of the kind of principles that I think popped out of thinking about this, and I'd like to confirm this with people, I tried to write down in this paragraph that like doing like this, like doing greasing at all and having grease values really only makes sense in a protocol where that particular like an unknown value is ignored and allowed by default. Like there are some cases where you can have like a mandatory flag, and like it should like essentially never make sense to mark a grease value as like this is mandatory to handle because like it is inherently meaningless. But like for this to work, like when we run through this scenario, it essentially assumes that like in the HTTP stream case that the unknown values are allowed, and the fact that certain values are disallowed is the special cases. Like you can have some known values that cause you to throw errors, but you must be tolerant of all other values. And if you don't have that set up, you shouldn't be doing grease because it's just not going to be effective or going to work. Does that make sense to people? Do we think that's the right thing? And also, like, is that something we highlighted? Of like,
I feel that goes a little bit without saying, because you can only grease a space where you have an unused space. Basically, what you are saying is that you actually have a space where every value is used, and then you cannot grease anyway.
well, I mean, I don't know if it means that like every value is used already. Like you could have a scenario where like I don't think this is like, it's probably just a bad idea in general, like protocol, because we generally be tolerant of unknown space where you haven't yet registered every value in the register. Let's say you have a just like a 8-bit space, but receive like for any particular version, clients should reject anything that they understand. And I think
So if
like
you
there
have
are
an unused, okay, then I misunderstood you. If you have an unused space, there are two reactions you can have. Either you ignore it, or you kind of fail, whatever. I mean, closing the connection or whatever.
right.
So one reaction has to be specified, right? If the value is ignored, then you can like safely test it, but then it might also not get locked or whatever. If the value causes like connection closure, whatever is defined, of course you have to consider this in your greasing, right? So like then it means kind of effectively you're greasing the whole connection if it causes a connection close. So if you use a grease value, you know that the connection should be closed afterwards. If it doesn't, it's a failure, and then this is only a greasing connection. You cannot use it for anything real.
It essentially up a layer such that the thing that becomes a throwaway is the broader context. Yeah.
But I think that also goes a little bit without saying that if there's unused code point space, then some reaction should be defined in the protocol. If no reaction is defined, that is actually missing in the protocol, and it's a problem on its own. And then you shouldn't do greasing because you don't know what will happen. But that is, the protocol is not defined fully. But there is some reaction that is defined to this onion space, and of course you have to take into account what the reaction is and if it makes sense for you to grease or not.
Right. I do think that, like, right.
Oh, we lost Tommy.
Looks like it.
Hello.
Now you're
Hello.
back.
Okay, sorry about that. I don't know what happened. Thanks, Mitako. So I think what you're getting at, definitely right, and I think kind of fits into this section well, that the protocol design or the specification needs to be very clear about how do you how is it recommending handling values and the algorithms. And I think, like, obviously, like, it's a bad idea if you don't specify well enough at all, so it's unclear about how to handle unknown values. But I think, like, in this case of the coding example that Martin was bringing up as a problem, it's a case where, like, I was already trying to suggest that people like designing the protocol specification give more clear examples about, like, how should implementers handle the algorithm for, like, these cases, and not even just like the high level, like, here's how you handle unknown things, but like, okay, in this case, if it is an error to receive this type in this case, what should be the logic for handling the other ones? And I think, Lucas, you had brought up on the pull request, like, should we even recommend, like, having what were you saying, like, the, like, a test vector to say, like, make your implementation handle this and make sure that you handle it correctly so that your algorithm was implemented correctly.
Yeah, like, I think even just looking at the text here as it is, I was looking at the markdown, but like, I really like this addition, but that we have these bullet points that say, like, here's what the failure is, then the paragraph just underneath is like, oh, here's actually the correct way to do that. It might be nice just to then immediately provide an actual pseudocode good example. You could define, valid range, invalid range, grease, but in an abstract sense, and just show people, like, concretely what we mean. Because I think when you take people on that journey and they suddenly realize, they go, oh, this is actually really simple. But it's presented quite often, greasing, in a way that sounds more complicated than it is. And therefore, if we're going to recommend to implementations, maybe, like, define pseudocode if your protocol elements are really, like, more complicated than what's presented here, then they should. But if it's not more complicated, then we just have a nice kind of reference example. I do think test vectors are good. Personally, we've used them in a few of the working groups and documents I've been participating in. There's always a question about whether they should go in the document themselves, in an appendices, or if they should just be in supporting material. I know EDM has we've done some work on that previously about additional resources on the data tracker, etc. I think it is good because it lets people write offline tests for their protocols first to validate them. But then again, if it should be so simple, maybe we don't need them. I don't know. Examples are always a bit of a contentious area to me. Finally, the one thing that just came up then, as Miria was talking, and I think it's implicit in this text, but that we're talking about values, and those values need to be valid within the range of the code point space that we're talking about. Because as a receiver, we have protocol elements that may be the logical ranges between. So, like, it's a 32-bit, so it could carry 30 bits of that to express some logical value, but actually it's constrained down further within the protocol definition that you're only going to support up to 16 bits worth of values, and that's the validation you would start with. Is the value bigger than this thing? And if not, if it is, error and that stuff. So this has only just come to mind right now, and I'm not explaining it very well, but
yeah, I think it's useful to bring up in here, because I guess I would phrase that as like there's a distinction between, you know, unknown values and invalid values, and of course invalid values you should be strict about, and I guess people describing the algorithms for handling reading values need to be very clear in the algorithm. What should you do for invalid values? What should you do for unknown values? And if you have some tricky logic, you should spell it out and give some pseudocode.
I mean, actually, to phrase it in the way I put it earlier. So, I mean, of course, there is a field, right? So you cannot have more bits than in the field. So there's a natural limit. But if you say, I'm not like the protocol doesn't use the full values of the field, then that means like still you have the same field, and one field has this valid code points where some of them are not used, and probably the protocol specifies that these values should just be ignored. And the other part of the values that you're not using and are not valid, you have probably created an error message or whatever, connection close again or whatever, I don't know. So put it in the way I phrased it earlier, it's like you have to understand what the reaction is for using a certain value.
Right, that makes sense. Okay. So then the last new chunk was my attempt at talking about the incentives, and this is something that I believe Dave Taylor had filed an issue on. And I'm actually, as we're discussing, I'm thinking that this should probably be, I didn't want it to have it within the considerations for greasing. Specifically, it felt like a higher level conversation. I think actually it could be moved to be, you know, considerations on incentives for greasing and variability. I think it's like kind of everything here. So I think that's one thing that needs to be expanded. I think there's could be quite a lot to say around the incentive structures here. I was trying to approach it by noting that, of course, right, like when you are adding greasing or variability, you're trying to break ossification. It's a risky thing. Stuff could break or have errors, and we need to consider kind of the effect of doing that, and if kind of like who gets blamed for that, or who incurs the cost of doing this, and like what are the ways to mitigate that. So this is just like a taxonomy that was based on brief thinking about it, of like you could have the approach of you do it from the beginning. That's I think what a lot of people tried to do with Quick, of saying like you're baking this in to the practice of what's going on inside the encrypted protocol, so it's visible to all the participants. And if people are doing a good job of this from the beginning, anyone who is coming up with a new implementation is going to encounter it soon, and they're the new ones. And so the practice of greasing, if it is sustained from the beginning, isn't going to cause a problem, or the practice of variability. But obviously you can't always do it from day zero. A lot of the cases we've seen, like why TLS was doing in the first place, was to try to break down existing ossification. So the kind of the middle option I was suggesting is like, you can do it when you already have change, or you have new participants in the protocol. Like let's say you're going from TLS 1.2 to 1.3, or you're going to 1.4, like you have some other big version change that's a shift in the protocol that's going to require updates in order to be compatible, that that kind of in order to start working with your implementation, someone's going to need to be a new mover. And so like you're not, like if you do greasing from the beginning of your implementation of a new protocol version, other people who also are updating and moving with you later, if they would then start encountering greasing or variability from the beginning of using that, and it's potentially more likely to succeed. And this kind of really applies to the cases where you have, like the two participants, or at least the known participants of the protocol. If the ossification you're dealing with is like on the network path of some middle box, and it's not going to update for anything, you're kind of host. And then the last case is kind of what I would consider to be the worst one, but like more gracefully handling the fact that your greasing may cause problems, and use some heuristics or algorithms to recognize that you are encountering issues because of it, and kind of learning to turn it off, but turning it on more aggressively in cases where it does succeed, so that at least things that are not yet ossified don't start to ossify. So I guess, does this taxonomy make sense? Are there other cases of how we can kind of work through the incentives here?
That sounds, whatever, go ahead.
I was going to say, I thought, we could add loads more things here, and actually, I stepped back from that last night. I think this is a succinct enough set of examples. Maybe we want to elaborate slightly, but otherwise, like, I think this amount of text is pretty good.
Yeah, I just wanted to say, I think these points sound all good and reasonable. I would maybe, because I was when I saw first the PR saying incentive for greasing, it's like, why does this document talk about incentives for greasing? Because when you read the document, you probably want to grease, right? But what you really want is kind of directly talking to the protocol developers and basically say why and when should you grease? When is it useful? So I would kind of maybe rename the section and put it at the beginning of the document, and have that in mind, that this is still not like explaining other people why somebody might want to grease or not. It's still talking to protocol developers why they should be greasing or not. If that
And by
sense.
protocol developers, you mean like the people building the implementations and deploying the implementations, not the protocol designers? Or
Both, but it's not like explaining to somebody else that have observed some greasing why somebody's doing that or not. It's not like, generally talking about the pros and cons of greasing. It's really more like, how can I, as a protocol developer or designer, decide if greasing makes sense for me now or not?
right. Exactly. Yeah. So it's not about why do you do greasing. It's in some ways it's about like the disincentives about what's stopping you from greasing.
It's more like, when should you or when should you not do it, kind of. Yeah. I don't think it makes much difference in the text, but maybe I would change maybe the heading slightly a little bit, put it at the beginning of the document, because that's the first question you need to answer. Should I actually, given the deployment I have and the consideration, the application I'm using, should I actually do greasing at all or not, before you think about how to do it? Yep.
That's a good point. I mean, we could also have something like in the intro section that kind of introduces like, why are you doing greasing, and then it can link
cases where like this type of deployment consideration ends up being a bit lower in the document, but we can keep it on that separately. Okay. We're getting up on time here. I think this is a useful discussion. I think the protocol variability bit needs a bit of a pass. So we can work on that. But I guess other high-level comments that people have, or do you think there are other things that, like, once we get some of these ironed out, that we'd like to see before we try to take it to more of a like hey, we're considering adopting this, and we review it with architecture discuss.
I think just looking through the GitHub issues, like there's lots of stuff there, and the potential we could try and add lots and lots of different examples. I don't want to do loads and loads of work for that though, and just add more text that we might decide later on is actually we need to delete because it's not helpful. But specifically, there was one that Cullen raised, or not I say one, but a topic Cullen raised about examples in zip and RTP that maybe ask different questions or visit this through kind of a different look. I wonder if it might be useful. Cullen shared some of those on a mailing list back in November 2023. I wonder if it might be a useful exercise to try and prepare some text based on those, just to see if it modifies any of our thinking of what's here or the way that we're presenting it in a positive way, so we can make this more applicable to people.
Yeah. Okay. We can look at that. All right. Anything else, or we can wrap up a couple minutes early? Corey, go ahead.
Mira asked who was meant to read the document, and that's not quite clear in the abstract.
Yeah. If you drop a comment on that PR, that'd be good. I guess it was potentially a bit too subtle, but I'm trying to infer here on this last sentence. These are considerations for designing and deploying grease and variability mechanism. So it's a bit of a two audience thing where you have both the document authors writing specifications that are defining grease mechanisms, but also the people when you choose to deploy it and you say, is this right for me? Should I actually start doing it now? I think are the two relevant audiences.
Well, I always love it when the abstract tells you who's supposed to read it, because then they might read it.
Yeah,
maybe we could bash a little bit on the abstract at some point, and just make sure that the abstract and introduction tie in with the audience that we expect.
This is the version which I've already bashed a lot in my PR. So if you can go into the PR while the hood is up, please suggest text directly into there.
Yeah,
I'll go for the PR. Yeah.
For clarity, the current published version of this document in the abstract does have that as the sentence. This document is intended for blah blah blah. And I think I raised the comment I could live without it in the abstract myself, because in the introduction it's within the first sentence of the introduction. I think if you want to scroll down, Tommy, or it's very early on. So I think we could hammer this out on the PR, but yeah, I kind of we very clearly had that statement there before, because I think this topic came up. Yeah, there we go.
Yeah. Okay. I mean, I'll look at the PR and do that over the weekend, so that'll be fine.
I appreciate that. Alrighty. With that, we're at time. I appreciate all your discussion, and we may try to have a short slot sometime at the Madrid meeting to all talk. So thank you all. Talk to you later.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye-bye.